She stood in line with 40 men, and the foreman made her a spectacle. Ridge Calder didn't just refuse Lian Wu work, he turned her into a warning, a joke, proof that some people didn't belong. In front of the whole hiring crowd, he declared her cursed, worthless, and sent her away like livestock to the poorest fool he could find. What Calder didn't know was that the scarred rancher on barren land would become the only man who ever saw her clearly. This is the story of a woman the world discarded and the ground she made bloom. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Lian's story travels. And if this story grabs you, hit that like button and settle in. Let's begin. The hiring line formed before dawn, but Lian Wu didn't arrive until the sun had crested the hills east of Bitterroot. She knew what that meant. The good positions would be gone, ranch hands, stable work, kitchen help for the bigger spreads. What remained would be the jobs no one wanted, mucking stalls, cleaning outhouses, scrubbing laundry for $1 a week. She didn't care. She needed work, and work didn't care about pride. The line snaked along the side of the mercantile, 40 men deep, maybe more. Shoulders hunched, hats low, hands shoved in pockets against the morning chill that hadn't yet burned off. They smelled of sweat, tobacco, and desperation. Lian took her place at the end, smoothing her plain cotton dress, adjusting the single braid that hung down her back. The fabric was worn thin in places, patched at the elbows, but it was clean. She'd made sure of that. Clean was something she could control. No one turned to look at her. That was normal. Lian had learned long ago that to most people, she was either invisible or a curiosity, and invisibility was safer. She kept her eyes down, watching the dust settle around her boots, listening to the low murmur of conversation up ahead. Men talking about cattle prices, weather patterns, which ranches were hiring and which were letting people go. The usual concerns of those who lived and died by the land. The foreman stood on a raised platform near the front, a broad-shouldered man with a leather vest and a voice that carried like a preacher's. Ridge Calder. She'd heard his name before, whispered with a mixture of respect and fear in the boarding house where she'd been staying. He ran the largest cattle operation in the territory, and when Calder's ranch hired, the whole county showed up. Men traveled from 3 towns over just for the chance to stand in this line. Next, Calder's voice cracked through the air like a whip. A man shuffled forward, thin, older, his shirt patched at the elbows, much like Lian's dress. His hands trembled slightly as he removed his hat. "You handle cattle?" Calder asked, not looking up from the ledger in front of him. "Some, sir. I worked the Patterson spread 2 seasons back." "Patterson's been gone 3 years." "Yes, sir, time's been hard." "Some ain't good enough. Next!" The man slunk away, his shoulders curved inward like he was trying to disappear into himself. Lian watched him go and felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She knew that posture, had worn it herself many times. Another stepped up, then another. Calder's decisions were swift, brutal, final. Yes. No. Maybe if you come back in a month when we're moving the herd north. The line moved forward in jagged increments, and Lian moved with it, her feet carrying her closer to the platform, closer to judgment. She kept her breathing steady, her hands folded in front of her. She had learned long ago that stillness was a kind of armor. If you didn't move, didn't react, sometimes people forgot you were there. Sometimes they left you alone. But invisibility only worked when people chose not to see you. The sun climbed higher, pressing heat down on the crowd. Lian felt sweat gather at the small of her back, between her shoulder blades. Her throat was dry, but she didn't reach for the canteen at her hip. Didn't want to draw attention, just kept moving forward, one step at a time, as the line shortened and her turn drew closer. When she reached the platform, the murmur of the crowd shifted. It was subtle at first, a pause in conversation, a turning of heads. Then louder, more obvious. A few men glanced back. One elbowed his neighbor. Another whispered something Lian couldn't quite hear, but the tone was clear enough. Amusement, curiosity, mockery. Lian felt the change in the air before Calder even spoke. It was like a storm gathering, pressure building, the moment before lightning struck. "Well, hell," Calder said slowly, finally looking up from his ledger. His voice was amused, entertained. "What do we have here?" Lian met his gaze. His eyes were pale, the color of dirty ice, and they moved over her like she was livestock at auction, assessing, judging, finding her lacking before she'd even opened her mouth. "I'm looking for work," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, but her heart hammered against her ribs. Calder's grin widened, showing teeth. "Work." "Yes, sir." "You got a name?" "Lian Wu." "Wu." He drew the name out, tasting it, mocking it. "That Chinese?" "Yes, sir." "Well, Miss Wu, I appreciate you coming all the way out here," Calder said, leaning back on his platform like he had all the time in the world. "But I don't think we got much use for you." Lian's fingers tightened against her skirt, but her voice stayed calm. She'd practiced this, rehearsed it in her mind 100 times. "I can clean, I can cook, I can work a garden, I can mend clothes and tend animals. I don't need much pay." Calder laughed. It wasn't a kind sound. It was the laugh of a man who found the world endlessly amusing because he stood at the top of it. "Honey, you don't understand. This is a cattle ranch. We need men, strong backs, folks who can pull their weight. I can work hard." "I'm sure you think so." He glanced at the men in line, playing to his audience now. "But let me explain something to you. A ranch is a serious operation. We got stock to move, fences to mend, predators to shoot. We got real work. You know what real work is?" "Yes, sir." "Do you?" He tilted his head, studying her like she was a puzzle he was solving. "Because where I'm standing, I see a little widow woman who probably spent her whole life indoors. No offense, but you don't look like you could lift a water bucket, let alone haul feed or fix a fence line in the middle of winter." Lian's jaw tightened. "I've done all of that." "Have you now?" "Yes." She forced herself to hold his gaze, to not look away, to not give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. "I worked my husband's farm for 3 years before he died. I know what hard work is." Calder straightened slightly, his expression shifting from amusement to something colder. "Here's the thing, Miss Wu. Even if you could do the work, which I doubt, I got 40 men in this line who can do it better, stronger, faster, and without—" He waved a hand vaguely. "All the complications." "Complications?" "You know what I mean." His voice dropped, just loud enough for the men nearby to hear, just loud enough to make sure his words would spread. "Folks around here got superstitions. They think some people bring bad luck, widows especially." "Foreign widows?" "That's double trouble." The murmur in the crowd grew louder. A man near the front muttered something about his cousin's ranch going under after they hired a widow. Another mentioned a crop failure. It didn't matter that none of it was connected. That correlation wasn't causation. Stories like that stuck, became truth through repetition. Calder raised his voice again, addressing the line as much as Lian. "Now, I'm not saying I believe all that superstition nonsense, but I got a crew to manage, and I can't have my men spooked or distracted. Bad for morale, bad for business. You understand?" Lian said nothing. There was nothing to say. She had heard it all before, in different words from different mouths, but always the same message. You don't belong. You're not wanted. You bring misfortune just by existing. Calder clapped his hands together, the sound sharp in the morning air. "But I'll tell you what. I'm a fair man. I'm not going to send you away empty-handed. That wouldn't be Christian of me." He turned, scanning the crowd with theatrical slowness. "Anybody here need help? Kitchen work? Laundry? Maybe someone's got a wife who needs an extra pair of hands?" Silence, the kind that pressed down heavy and thick, full of judgment and distance. "Come on now," Calder said, his tone mocking. "Surely somebody's got a use for her. She's willing to work cheap." More silence. A few men shifted uncomfortably, their eyes sliding away. Others smirked, enjoying the show. Lian stood perfectly still, her spine straight, her hands steady despite the humiliation burning through her veins like acid. Calder sighed dramatically. "Well, that's a shame. Guess nobody—" "I'll take her." The voice came from the back of the crowd, rough and low, cutting through the tension like a blade. Heads turned, men parted. A man stood near the edge of the platform, half in shadow. Tall, lean, his hat pulled low enough that Lian couldn't see his face clearly. His clothes were worn, his boots scuffed, and there was something in the way he held himself, rigid, guarded, like a man who expected trouble and was ready for it, that made the other men step aside without thinking. Calder's grin faltered. "Hale?" The man stepped forward into the light, and Leon saw him fully for the first time. Mid-30s, maybe older, though hard living could age a man fast out here. His face was weathered, windburned, marked by a scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw, thick and pale against his tanned skin. His eyes were dark, unreadable, the kind of eyes that had seen too much and decided to stop letting it show. "You need help?" Calder asked, his tone edged with surprise and something else. Contempt, maybe. Or pity. "Could use a hand," Ethan Hale said. His voice was quiet but carried weight, like he didn't waste words because he knew they wouldn't change much anyway. Calder laughed, louder this time. "A hand? Hale, you can barely keep yourself afloat out there. What are you going to pay her with? Dirt?" "That's my business." "Is it now?" Calder looked between them, clearly entertained by this new development. "You sure about this? I mean, she's cursed and all. Might drag you down even further than you already are." Ethan's gaze didn't shift. "I'll take her." Calder shrugged, still grinning. "Your funeral, friend. Don't say I didn't warn you." He turned to Leon, waving her away like she was an inconvenience he was glad to be rid of. "Well, Miss Wu, looks like you got yourself a job. Lucky you." Leon didn't feel lucky. She felt like cargo being handed off, like a problem someone else was now stuck with. But she nodded, because what else could she do? "Go on," Calder said, already turning to the next man in line. "Hale's wagon is around back. Don't keep him waiting." Leanne walked past the platform, past the line of men who stared at her like she was something strange and pitiful, something to be avoided. She didn't look at any of them. She kept her eyes forward, her spine straight, even as her hands trembled and her chest felt tight with shame and anger and a fear she couldn't quite name. Ethan Hale was already walking toward the back of the mercantile. She followed, her boots scuffing in the dust, the sun beating down on her shoulders. His wagon was old, the wood sun-bleached and splitting in places where the boards had dried out and shrunk. A single horse stood hitched to it, a gray mare with ribs showing through her coat, her head hanging low. The wagon bed was empty except for a few tools and a water barrel that looked like it had seen better days. Ethan climbed onto the driver's bench without a word, settling into the seat with practiced ease. Leon hesitated only a moment before climbing up beside him. The bench was narrow, forcing them to sit closer than she would have liked, but Ethan didn't seem to notice or care. He didn't look at her, didn't speak, just snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward with a creak of old wood and the jingle of harness. They rode in silence through the town, past the saloon with its faded paint and broken railing, past the general store where a woman stood in the doorway watching them with narrowed eyes, past the church with its whitewashed walls and crooked cross. A few people paused to watch them pass, but no one waved. No one smiled. Leon kept her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the road ahead. She wanted to say something, to break the heavy silence, but she didn't know what. Thank you seemed inadequate. An explanation felt unnecessary, so she said nothing. After a while, the buildings thinned and disappeared, replaced by open land. Rolling hills covered in dry grass, scattered juniper trees, red earth stretching out under a sky so big it made her feel small and insignificant. The sun climbed higher, and the heat pressed down like a weight, making her dress stick to her back, making her throat dry despite the water she'd drunk that morning. Ethan still hadn't spoken. His hands were steady on the reins, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The scar on his face was old, the skin puckered and pale, the kind of injury that had healed badly because there'd been no one to tend it properly. She wondered how he'd gotten it, but she didn't ask. Didn't have the right to ask. Didn't know if he'd answer, even if she did. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, Leon broke it. "Thank you." Ethan didn't respond, didn't even glance at her. "For taking me on," she added, her voice quieter. "Don't thank me yet." His voice was flat, almost cold, like he was delivering bad news and wanted to get it over with. Leon fell quiet again, the brief warmth of gratitude fading into uncertainty. The road stretched on, winding through land that grew drier and rockier with every mile. They passed a few ranches, Well-kept spreads with strong fences, painted barns, cattle grazing in pastures that still held some green despite the summer heat. But Ethan didn't turn toward any of them. He kept going farther out, where the grass turned to dust and the trees disappeared entirely, leaving nothing but scrub brush and stones. Finally, Ethan turned the wagon off the main road onto a narrow trail barely wide enough for the wheels. The ground was cracked, the earth the color of old bone, split open in places like wounds that had never healed. In the distance, Leon saw a structure. A cabin, maybe, though it was hard to tell from this far away. As they drew closer, the reality of her situation settled over her like a shroud, heavy and suffocating. The cabin was small, maybe 12 feet square, and it was sagging on one side like the foundation had given out. The roof was patched with mismatched boards, some newer than others, all weathered to different shades of gray. The windows were dark, one of them covered with oiled cloth instead of glass, flapping slightly in the hot wind. Behind the cabin stood a barn, or what was left of one. The walls leaned inward at dangerous angles. The door hung crooked on broken hinges, and the whole thing looked like a strong wind might knock it flat. A pen held 3 cattle, their coats dull and patchy, their movements sluggish in the heat. They were thin, not starving, but not far from it. A chicken coop sat near the cabin, listing to one side, empty except for a single scrawny hen that pecked half-heartedly at the bare ground. This wasn't a ranch. It wasn't even a homestead. It was a ruin, a testament to failure and desperation. Ethan pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down without a word. Leon sat frozen, staring at the wasteland around her, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with any kind of future, any kind of hope. "You coming?" Ethan's voice cut through her shock. She climbed down slowly, her boots sinking into the loose dirt. The ground felt unstable beneath her feet, like it might give way at any moment. Ethan walked toward the cabin, and she followed, her mind racing. She had expected hard work. She had expected poverty. But this was barely survival. This was a man holding on by his fingernails, trying to keep something alive that maybe should have died a long time ago. Inside, the cabin was worse. One room, a dirt floor packed hard from years of use, an iron stove in the corner that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in months, a table with one broken leg propped up with a stack of flat stones, a cot shoved against the wall, the blanket threadbare and stained. The air smelled of old smoke, dust, and something sour she couldn't identify but made her stomach turn. There was no decoration, no softness, nothing to suggest this was a home rather than just a place someone existed. Ethan dropped his hat on the table and turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "You'll sleep in here," he said, gesturing to the cot. "I'll take the barn." Leon nodded, unable to find her voice. "There's a well out back. Water's clean, but you'll have to haul it yourself. Stove works if you can get it started. There's a root cellar under the floor." He towed a loose board. "Might be some potatoes left. Maybe some onions." He paused, watching her with those dark, unreadable eyes. "I can't pay you much. $1 a week plus food and a roof. You don't like it, you can leave any time. I won't stop you." Leon met his gaze. She thought about the long walk back to town, the empty rooms at the boarding house, the whispers that would follow her, the doors that would close. She thought about Calder's laughter, the way the men had looked at her, the certainty that there was nowhere else to go. "I'll stay," she said. "We'll see." He turned and walked out, leaving her standing in the middle of the broken-down cabin, surrounded by dust and silence and the weight of choices that had led her here. Leon exhaled slowly, looking around at the dirt floor, the grimy stove, the walls that let in light through gaps in the boards. The window showed her the barren yard, the dying cattle, the endless expanse of cracked earth stretching to the horizon. She set down the small bundle she'd carried with her. Everything she owned fit inside a single cloth sack and rolled up her sleeves. If this was where she would live, she would make it livable. She didn't have any other choice. The first task was the stove. Leon knelt in front of it, her knees pressing into the hard dirt floor, and pried open the iron door. Inside was a disaster. Thick ash, half-burned wood that had never fully caught, and what looked like the remains of a bird's nest, dry twigs and grass woven together and then abandoned. She scooped it out with her bare hands, the ash coating her fingers, sticking under her nails, making her cough as it puffed into the air. She carried it outside in handfuls and dumped it in the dirt behind the cabin. Then she searched for kindling. There wasn't much. A few dry branches near the barn, scattered pieces of wood that might have once been part of a fence, some scraps that looked like they'd been cut for a purpose, and then forgotten. She gathered what she could, her arms full of brittle wood, and brought it back inside. Starting the fire took longer than it should have. The flue was clogged with something, debris or maybe a nest from some animal that had climbed down the chimney, and smoke filled the room before she finally got it drawing properly. She waved her hand in front of her face, coughing, eyes watering, but she kept at it until the flames finally caught and the stove began to warm. The heat spread slowly, pushing back the chill that had settled into the cabin despite the summer sun outside. Leanne stood there for a moment, watching the fire, feeling a small sense of accomplishment. It wasn't much, but it was something. Next, she tackled the floor. It was covered in dirt. Not just dust, but actual dirt, like someone had tracked it in for months and never bothered to sweep. There were dried mud clumps, bits of straw, things she didn't want to identify. Leanne found an old rag in the corner, stiff and filthy, and wet it from the bucket she'd filled at the well. The water was cold, clean like Ethan had said, and it felt good on her hands after the heat of the stove. She scrubbed the floor on her hands and knees, working in sections, the rag turning black almost immediately. Her knees ached against the hard-packed earth. Her hands burned from the rough fabric and the constant wringing, but she didn't stop. She scrubbed until her arms shook, until her back screamed in protest, until the floor was at least cleaner than it had been, even if it would never truly be clean. By the time the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed almost violent in their beauty, the cabin looked marginally better. The floor was cleaner. The stove was functional. Leanne had found 3 potatoes in the root cellar, small, wrinkled things that had seen better days, but they were edible. She boiled them in the rusted pot, added a pinch of salt she found in a jar on the shelf, and mashed them with a fork that had only 2 tines. She set one portion aside on a tin plate and carried it out to the barn. Ethan was inside, sitting on an overturned crate in the dim light filtering through the gaps in the walls. He was sharpening a knife, the blade scraping against a whetstone in steady, rhythmic strokes. He looked up when she entered, his expression guarded, surprised. "I made food," Leanne said, holding out the plate wrapped in cloth to keep it warm. He stared at it for a long moment, like he wasn't sure what to make of the gesture. Then he set down the knife and whetstone and took the plate without a word. Leanne turned and walked back to the cabin, not waiting for thanks she knew wouldn't come. She ate her own portion slowly, sitting on the cot, staring at the fire in the stove. The potato was bland, mealy, but it filled the empty space in her stomach. She washed it down with water from the bucket, then lay back on the cot, pulling the thin blanket around her shoulders. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose boards on the cabin, whispering through the gaps. The night sounds of the prairie filtered in, crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, the creak of the barn settling. Leanne closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling at her like an undertow. Her body ached in 100 different places. Her hands were raw, her knees bruised, her back stiff. But she had survived the first day. And tomorrow, she would start again. The days that followed blurred together into a rhythm of relentless, punishing work. Leanne woke before dawn each morning, the cold air biting at her skin as she climbed out of bed and stoked the fire in the stove. She hauled water from the well, the bucket heavy and awkward, her arms burning by the time she made it back to the cabin. She cooked whatever scraps she could find. More potatoes, a few eggs from the stubborn hen, once a rabbit that Ethan had trapped and left on the doorstep without comment. Then she moved on to the endless list of tasks that Ethan left for her, written in rough handwriting on scraps of paper or delivered in terse sentences when he came by the cabin in the morning. Fix the chicken coop. Water the cattle. Clear the weeds behind the barn. Scrub out the water barrel. He didn't explain how to do any of it, didn't show her, just expected her to figure it out. So she did. She learned to patch the chicken coop using wire and scraps of wood, her fingers bleeding from the sharp edges. She learned to judge how much water the cattle needed, how to coax them to drink when they were stubborn. She learned which weeds could be pulled easily and which had roots that went down deep, requiring a shovel and patience she didn't know she had. Ethan himself was a ghost. He left early each morning, before the sun had fully risen, and worked the land alone. She would see him in the distance sometimes, a dark figure against the horizon, bent over a fence post or leading the cattle to new grazing ground. He returned only when the light was nearly gone, his face drawn with exhaustion, his clothes soaked with sweat. He spoke in short, clipped sentences when he spoke at all. Need more water in the trough. Fence post by the south pasture is loose. Roof's leaking in the barn. See if you can patch it. And Leanne would nod and add it to the list of things she was already doing. The blisters on her hands split and bled, then hardened into calluses. Her back ached from hauling buckets, her arms burned from scrubbing, her legs trembled from walking the dry, cracked land in the relentless heat. But she didn't complain. She didn't slow down. She didn't ask for help. Ethan watched her sometimes. She could feel his gaze, sharp and assessing, like he was waiting for her to break, waiting for her to prove him right, that she was weak, that she couldn't handle it, that she would quit just like everyone probably told him she would. She never did. One evening, as she carried a bucket of water to the cattle pen, her boot caught on a rock hidden in the loose dirt. She stumbled, tried to catch herself, but the weight of the bucket pulled her off balance. She went down hard, the bucket flying from her hands, water spilling across the ground in a dark stain that disappeared almost immediately into the thirsty earth. Leanne sat there for a moment, staring at the wet dirt, her vision blurring. Every muscle in her body screamed. Her hands were raw and bleeding again. Her dress was soaked with sweat and filth, and she had just wasted half a bucket of water that had taken her 15 minutes to haul from the well. Leave it. She turned. Ethan stood a few feet away, his hat in his hands, his expression unreadable in the fading light. I'll finish, Leanne said, her voice rough. You can barely stand. I'm fine. You're not. She bent to pick up the bucket, but her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't get a grip on the handle. Ethan stepped forward and took it from her, his fingers brushing hers for just a moment. Rough skin against rough skin, both of them marked by the same brutal work. Go inside, he said quietly, not looking at her. Leanne hesitated, pride warring with exhaustion. The cattle. I'll handle it. Go. She wanted to argue, wanted to prove she could finish what she started, but her legs were shaking and her vision kept swimming, and she wasn't sure she could actually make it back to the well without falling again. So she nodded and walked back to the cabin, each step an effort, her body threatening to give out entirely. Inside, she collapsed onto the cot without even taking off her boots. The room spun gently around her, and she closed her eyes against it, trying to breathe through the exhaustion. Outside, she heard the sound of water being poured, the low murmur of Ethan's voice as he spoke to the cattle in tones too quiet for her to make out the words. Leanne let the darkness take her, pulling her down into sleep so deep it was almost like drowning. When she woke, gray dawn light was filtering through the window. Someone had removed her boots and covered her with the blanket. A tin cup of water sat on the floor beside the cot. Leanne sat up slowly, her body stiff and aching, and drank the water in slow sips. Then she stood, pulled on her boots, and went back to work. Weeks passed. The brutal heat of summer gave way to slightly cooler mornings, though the afternoons were still punishing. The ranch didn't transform. It was still broken, still barely holding on, but it stopped falling apart quite so fast. Leanne patched the roof where it leaked, standing on a rickety ladder that swayed with every movement, her hands full of tar and wood strips. She fixed the chicken coop and coaxed 2 more hens from a neighboring ranch that Ethan had traded work for. She cleared the weeds from around the cabin and barn, creating space that felt a little less like wilderness trying to reclaim what humans had built. She hauled stones from the creek bed to reinforce the fence posts, her back screaming with each load. She scrubbed every surface she could reach until her hands were permanently stained and raw. She learned to read the weather, to know when rain was coming by the way the air felt and the way the cattle moved. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the silence between her and Ethan began to shift. It was no longer hostile. It was no longer the silence of 2 strangers forced together by circumstance. It was something else, something quieter, steadier, built on mutual exhaustion and the grudging respect that came from watching someone refuse to quit day after day. Ethan began to speak more. Not long conversations, he wasn't built for that, but small exchanges that carried weight. Hand me that hammer. Water's getting low. I'll fetch more after I finish this. You eat yet? Once, as they worked together on the fence, he paused and looked at her. Where'd you learn to swing a hammer like that? Leon didn't look up from the post she was bracing. My husband, before he died. What happened to him? Fever. Took him in 3 days. Her voice was flat, factual. She'd told the story enough times that the emotion had been worn away, leaving only the skeleton of truth. I'm sorry. Leon shrugged, driving a nail home with 3 solid strikes. It was a long time ago. Still, she glanced at him then and saw something in his face she hadn't expected. Understanding. Not pity. Understanding. The look of someone who knew what it meant to lose people, to carry grief like a weight you could never quite set down. What about you? She asked, surprising herself with the question. How'd you end up out here? Ethan turned back to the fence, his movements deliberate. Long story. I'm not going anywhere. He smiled faintly, a ghost of expression that disappeared almost as quickly as it came. War. Lost everything after. Figured I'd start over somewhere no one knew me. Did it work? Not sure yet. Leon returned to her work, but the conversation lingered between them, quiet and careful, like they were each testing the weight of the other's trust and finding it might hold. Another day, Leon found a piece of soap on the table inside the cabin. Good soap, the kind that smelled of lavender, not the harsh lye she'd been using. She hadn't asked for it. Ethan must have brought it from town, must have spent money they didn't have on something that wasn't strictly necessary. She picked it up, held it to her nose, and felt something warm and unfamiliar bloom in her chest. Another time, she noticed the broken leg on the table had been fixed properly, not just propped up with stones anymore. The repair was careful, solid, the work of someone who took pride in doing things right. Small gestures, quiet things that might have meant nothing or might have meant everything. Leon didn't mention them, and neither did Ethan. But the distance between them kept shrinking inch by inch, like 2 people learning to share the same small space without constantly colliding. One evening, as the sun set in streaks of red and gold, they sat outside the cabin, too tired to go inside yet, too hot to want the fire. The air was finally cooling, carrying the smell of dust and sage. You ever think about leaving? Ethan asked suddenly. Leon looked at him, surprised by the question. Leaving where? Here. The territory. Going somewhere easier. Easier how? He shrugged. I don't know. California? Oregon? Somewhere the ground isn't trying to kill you every day. Leon considered that, watching the last of the sunlight paint the barren hills in shades of copper. I've been to easy places. They weren't better. No? No. She pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms around them. Easy places have easy cruelty. People smile while they tell you you're not welcome. At least here, the land doesn't pretend to be something it's not. Ethan studied her, his hands still, his expression thoughtful. You really believe that? I do. He went back to oiling the leather strap he'd been working on, but she saw the faint curve of his mouth, like he was trying not to smile and failing just a little. It was late autumn when the first real cold came, sweeping down from the mountains with a bite that went straight through clothes and settled in bones. Leon kept the cabin warm, kept the stove fed with wood she'd split herself, learning to read the grain and find the sweet spot where the axe would bite deep. She kept their clothes as clean as she could manage, mending tears with careful stitches, patching holes until there was more patch than original fabric. Ethan worked outside when he could, chopping wood, reinforcing the barn against the coming winter, checking the cattle for signs of illness or injury. But some days the cold was too vicious even for him, and he stayed inside sharpening tools, mending harnesses, doing the small tasks that accumulated like dust. Those days they talked more. You ever regret it? Leon asked one afternoon as she darned a sock and Ethan worked oil into a saddle. Taking me on that day? Ethan didn't answer right away. He stared at the leather in his hands, his expression distant, like he was looking at something far beyond the cabin walls. No, he said finally. I thought I would, but no. Why'd you do it? That day at the hiring line, Ethan was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost reluctant, like he was admitting something he'd rather keep hidden. Calder's a bastard, always has been. Watching him tear you down in front of all those men. He shook his head, his jaw tight. I couldn't stand it. So it was pity? No. Ethan looked at her directly, his gaze steady and honest. It was anger. And maybe something else. What? I saw how you stood there, didn't flinch, didn't beg, didn't break even when he was trying to make you small. He paused. That's not weakness. That's strength most people don't have. Leanne felt her chest tighten, felt something warm and overwhelming rise in her throat. She had been called many things in her life. Cursed, foreign, unlucky, strange, a burden. But never strong, never worth defending. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice thick. Ethan nodded and turned back to the saddle, but his ears had gone slightly red, and Leanne realized with surprise that he was embarrassed. They fell back into companionable silence, the fire crackling in the stove, the wind gentle outside for once. And in that moment, sitting in the small cabin that was slowly becoming something more than just shelter, Leanne felt the first stirrings of something she'd thought lost forever. Not just survival, not just endurance, but hope. The storm came 3 days after that conversation, announced by a shift in the wind that made the cattle restless and the chickens refused to leave their coop. Leanne felt it in her bones before she saw it in the sky, that heavy electric pressure that made her skin prickle and her breath come shorter. She'd learned to read the weather out here, had learned that the land spoke in its own language if you paid attention. The air smelled different, tasted different, like metal and rain and something wild. She was hanging laundry on the line she'd strung between the cabin and a fence post when the first gust hit, strong enough to tear the shirt from her hands and send it tumbling across the yard. She chased it down, her braid whipping across her face, and looked up at the horizon. Dark clouds massed in the distance, rolling toward them like a wall of bruised flesh, purple and black and green all mixed together in a way that made her stomach clench. Lightning flickered inside them, brief flashes that lit up the underbelly of the storm. Ethan was already in the yard when she turned around, his face set in hard lines as he studied the approaching weather. How bad? Leanne asked, coming to stand beside him, the wet shirt clutched in her hands. Bad enough. His voice was grim. Maybe worse than the last one. What do we need to do? Ethan turned to look at her, and she saw something flash in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or appreciation that she'd said we instead of you. Everything we can, and fast. They moved like soldiers preparing for battle, each knowing their role without needing to discuss it. Ethan went to reinforce the barn door, hammering extra boards across the frame with quick, efficient strikes. Leanne secured the chicken coop, weighted down the patched roof with every heavy stone she could carry, checked every latch twice, made sure the hens were all inside and safe. The wind picked up steadily, tugging at her dress, pulling strands of hair loose from her braid. The temperature dropped, that sudden chill that came before a serious storm, and goosebumps rose on her arms despite the exertion of hauling stones. She brought the cattle as close to the barn as possible, herding them into the most sheltered corner of the pen with sharp calls and firm hands. They were skittish, their eyes rolling white, their movements jerky with fear. Animals always knew when something bad was coming. Leanne! Ethan's voice cut through the rising howl of wind. Get inside! What about you? I need to check the well cover. I'll do it, she shouted back, already moving toward the well. Leanne, you check the barn. Make sure nothing's going to blow away. For a moment, she thought he would argue, would tell her to get to safety while he handled everything like he always did. But then he nodded sharply and ran toward the barn, trusting her to do what needed doing. Leanne fought her way to the well, the wind shoving her sideways, trying to push her off her feet. The wooden cover had already lifted, caught by the wind like a sail, banging against the stone rim with sharp cracks that echoed across the yard. She grabbed it with both hands, her fingers slipping on the weathered wood, and tried to pull it down. The wind caught it again, nearly tearing it from her grip. Her shoulders screamed in protest as she held on, bracing her feet against the ground, using every ounce of strength she'd built over months of brutal work. The first drops of rain hit, huge, cold, violent things that stung where they struck her skin. Within seconds, it went from drops to sheets, a wall of water that soaked her through and made it nearly impossible to see. Leanne pulled with everything she had, her hands burning, her arms shaking, and finally wrestled the cover into place. She jammed a heavy rock on top to hold it, her fingers numb and clumsy, then turned and ran for the cabin. The rain came at her horizontally now, driven by wind that screamed like something alive and angry. Lightning split the sky, so bright it left white scars across her vision, so close she could smell the ozone. Thunder followed immediately, a sound so deep it shook the ground beneath her feet and rattled her teeth. Leon burst through the cabin door just as Ethan came running from the barn. He slammed the door behind him, threw the bolt, and stood there breathing hard, water streaming from his hair, his clothes plastered to his body. They looked at each other across the small space of the cabin, both soaked, both breathing like they'd run a race. "You shouldn't have done that," Ethan said, his voice rough. "It's done. You could have been struck by lightning. So could you." Ethan's jaw tightened, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart skip. Fear, real fear, not for himself, but for her. "Don't do that again," he said quietly, intensely. "Do what?" "Risk yourself like that." Leon met his gaze steadily. "You do it all the time." "That's different. Why? Because you're a man and I'm a woman? Because your life matters more than mine?" "No." Ethan took a step closer, water dripping from his clothes onto the floor. "Because I couldn't—" He stopped, seemed to struggle with something, then continued in a voice barely louder than the storm. "Because I don't know what I'd do if something happened to you." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning, charged with something neither of them had acknowledged until now. Leon felt her breath catch. "Ethan." A massive crack of thunder cut her off, so loud it felt like the sky was breaking apart. The cabin shook. Something outside, a tree branch maybe, or part of the barn, slammed against the wall with a crash that made them both jump. Ethan turned away, peeling off his soaked coat with jerky movements. "We should get warm before we catch our death." Leon nodded, her heart still pounding, and moved to the stove. She fed it wood with shaking hands, built up the fire until heat began to spread through the small space, pushing back the cold that had settled into her bones. They hung their wet outer clothes near the stove, not looking at each other, the air between them thick with unspoken things. Leon changed into her spare dress behind the blanket she'd hung in the corner for privacy. When she emerged, Ethan had changed into dry pants and a shirt that had seen better days, the fabric worn soft from years of washing. The storm raged outside, wind screaming around the cabin, finding every gap and crack, howling through them like wolves. Rain pounded the roof in waves, so loud they had to raise their voices to be heard. Water began to seep under the door despite Leon's earlier efforts to seal it, pooling on the dirt floor in dark stains. Leon stuffed rags into the gap, but water kept coming, relentless and patient. Ethan fed the stove, keeping the fire high, driving back the cold and damp that wanted to creep into every corner. They sat close to it, closer than they normally would have, shoulders nearly touching, drawn together by the storm's violence and the need for warmth. "You ever seen one like this?" Leon asked after a while, watching lightning flash through the gaps in the walls. "Once. Year I got here." Ethan's voice was quiet, reflective. "Lost half the herd. Barn roof caved in. Took me 6 months to rebuild." "What did you do?" "Started over. Didn't have much choice." He glanced at her, his face shadowed in the firelight. "Didn't have help back then." "You have it now." Ethan's mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile, but close. "Yeah, I do." The cabin creaked and groaned around them, the walls shuddering with each powerful gust of wind. Leon wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stay warm despite the fire. The temperature had dropped sharply with the storm, and even dry clothes and flames couldn't quite chase away the chill. Without a word, Ethan shifted closer, his shoulder pressing against hers, solid and warm. The contact sent heat through her that had nothing to do with the fire. Neither of them moved away. They sat like that for a long time, listening to the storm tear at the world outside, feeling the cabin shake but hold, drawing comfort from each other's presence in a way that felt both natural and terrifying. "Tell me about him," Ethan said suddenly. "Your husband." Leon was quiet for a moment, surprised by the question. No one had asked about her husband in years. Most people treated her widowhood like a curse they didn't want to talk about, like speaking of the dead might invite bad luck. "His name was Chen," she said finally. "He was a good man, kind. He worked hard, never complained, always tried to see the best in people even when they didn't deserve it. How'd you meet? Arranged marriage. Our families knew each other back in China. We came to America together, thought we'd build something better here. She stared into the fire, seeing the past in the flames. He got sick 3 years after we arrived. Fever took him so fast there wasn't time to even say goodbye properly. One day he was fine, the next he was burning up, and 3 days later he was gone. I'm sorry, Ethan said quietly. Everyone's sorry. It doesn't change anything. Leon's voice was flat, factual, the emotion worn away by repetition. After he died, I tried to keep the farm going, but I couldn't do it alone. Sold everything, ended up in boarding houses, taking whatever work I could find, which wasn't much. Because people are fools. Leon smiled faintly. Some people. They fell silent again, the storm filling the space where conversation had been. Lightning flashed, illuminating the cabin in stark white bursts. Thunder rolled, continuous and ominous. What about you? Leon asked. You said you lost everything in the war. What did you lose? Ethan was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, like the words were being pulled from somewhere deep and painful. My family. Farm. Everything I thought I'd spend my life building. He stared at the fire, his jaw tight. Came back to find it all gone. Burned. My parents dead. Brother killed in the same battle that gave me this. He touched the scar on his face briefly. Had nothing left, no reason to stay. So I came west, figured I'd start over where nobody knew me, where I wouldn't have to see what I'd lost every time I looked around. Did it work? Not the way I thought it would. He looked at her then, his eyes dark and intense in the firelight. Turns out you can't outrun grief. It follows you wherever you go. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is learning to carry it and build something anyway. Is that what you're doing? Building something? Trying to. His voice softened. Wasn't sure it was worth the effort until recently. Leon felt her chest tighten, felt the weight of his words settle somewhere deep inside her. What changed? Ethan held her gaze, and for a moment the storm outside seemed distant, unimportant. You did. The air between them felt charged, electric in a way that had nothing to do with the lightning outside. Leon's heart pounded against her ribs, her breath coming shorter. Before she could respond, a massive gust of wind hit the cabin, so strong the whole structure shifted. A loud crack echoed from above, and suddenly water was pouring through a gap in the roof, a steady stream that hit the floor and started spreading. They both jumped up. Ethan grabbed a bucket and shoved it under the leak while Leon searched for something to patch it with. She found an old tarp in the corner, climbed onto the table despite Ethan's protests, and reached up to press it against the ceiling where water was coming through. Hold this, she said. Ethan climbed up beside her, his hands covering hers, both of them stretching to reach the leak. The table wobbled beneath their combined weight, threatening to collapse, but they held the tarp in place until Ethan could secure it with nails, hammering awkwardly above his head. Water still seeped around the edges, but the main flow stopped. They climbed down carefully, both breathing hard, and surveyed the damage. The floor was wet, the bucket half full, but the cabin was still standing. That's not going to hold if the storm gets worse, Ethan said. Then we'll fix it again. He looked at her, something like admiration in his eyes. You really don't quit, do you? No. Do you? Not anymore. The storm lasted through the night and into the next day, pounding the ranch with relentless fury. Leon and Ethan took turns sleeping, one of them always awake to watch for new leaks, to feed the fire, to make sure the cabin didn't fall apart around them. When Lan slept, she was vaguely aware of Ethan moving around the cabin, the sound of wood being added to the stove, the creak of floorboards. When Ethan slept, curled up on the floor near the fire because he'd insisted she take the cot, she found herself watching him, noting the way exhaustion had carved deeper lines around his eyes, the way his hand rested near the knife he kept close even in sleep. By the second morning, the wind had died down enough that they could venture outside. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and pale light filtered through the thinning clouds. The yard was a disaster. Branches and debris were scattered everywhere. The path to the well was a river of mud, and the chicken coop had lost its entire roof again despite all Leon's efforts to secure it. One section of the cattle pen fence had collapsed completely, the posts pulled right out of the waterlogged ground. But the barn was still standing, the cabin was still standing, and the cattle, though spooked and miserable, were all alive. Ethan stood in the doorway, surveying the damage, his face grim but not defeated. "We'll fix it," Leon said, coming to stand beside him. "It'll take weeks, maybe longer." "Then it takes weeks." He looked at her, studied her face like he was trying to memorize it, then nodded. "All right, let's get started." They worked all day, clearing debris, sorting salvageable wood from the wreckage, beginning the long process of rebuilding what the storm had destroyed. The mud sucked at their boots, made every step a battle, but they kept moving. Leon was hauling a broken fence post when her boot slipped. She went down hard, the post falling beside her, mud splashing up to coat her dress and face. For a moment she just sat there, too tired to get up, too overwhelmed to do anything but breathe. Ethan was there in seconds, pulling her up, his hands strong and sure on her arms. "You hurt?" "I'm fine." "You're not. Look at your hands." Leanne glanced down. Her palms were torn open again, blood mixing with mud, the cuts from earlier work reopened by the rough wood. "I'll wrap them," she said, trying to pull away. "You'll rest." Ethan's voice was firm but gentle. "I'll finish out here. It's too much for one person. I've done more with less." He guided her toward the cabin, his hand on her elbow supporting her weight. "Come on!" Leon wanted to argue, wanted to prove she could keep going, but her legs were shaking and her vision kept blurring at the edges. She let him lead her inside, let him sit her down at the table. He brought water and clean rags without being asked, and knelt in front of her to clean her hands. His touch was surprisingly gentle, careful as he wiped away the mud and blood, revealing the torn skin beneath. "You work too hard," he said quietly, not looking up from his task. "So do you." "That's different." "Why? Because you're used to it? Because you think you have to do everything yourself?" Ethan's hands stilled. "I'm used to being alone." "You're not alone anymore." He looked up at her then, and something passed between them. Understanding, recognition, maybe the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find in this broken place. "No," he said softly. "I'm not." He finished wrapping her hands in clean cloth, his fingers lingering just a moment longer than necessary. Then he stood, cleared his throat, and stepped back. "Rest for an hour, then we'll see how you feel." "Ethan?" "Please." The word seemed to cost him something. "Just rest." Leon nodded, too tired to fight anymore. She watched him walk back outside, his shoulders set with determination, and felt something warm bloom in her chest despite the exhaustion. She meant to rest for just an hour, but her body had other ideas. The moment she lay down on the cot, sleep pulled her under like a riptide, deep and dreamless. When she woke, it was dark outside. The fire in the stove had been built up, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Someone had removed her muddy boots and covered her with the blanket. A cup of water sat on the floor beside the cot, and next to it, a piece of cornbread wrapped in cloth. Leon sat up slowly, her body stiff and aching, but somehow better than before. She drank the water and ate the cornbread, surprised to find it still slightly warm. Ethan must have made it while she slept. She found him outside in the barn, working by lantern light to repair a section of wall that had come loose in the storm. He looked up when she entered, his face shadowed but his eyes catching the light. "You should still be resting," he said. "I've rested enough." Leanne picked up a hammer. "What needs doing?" Ethan studied her for a moment, like he was trying to decide whether to argue. Then he gestured to a pile of boards. "Hold these while I nail them." They worked together in companionable silence, the rhythm familiar now. He held, she braced, she passed, he hammered. The barn slowly took shape around them, still shabby and worn but functional, good enough to survive another storm. "Thank you," Leon said after a while, "for the food, for letting me rest." "You needed it." "Still, thank you." Ethan set down his hammer and turned to face her. "You don't need to keep thanking me for basic decency. Most people don't offer it. Then most people are worse than they should be." He paused, seemed to wrestle with something, then continued. You've worked harder than anyone I've ever known. Never complained, never quit, never asked for anything you didn't earn twice over. If anything, I should be thanking you. For what? For staying. For making this place feel like more than just somewhere I'm waiting to fail. His voice dropped lower, rougher. For making me want to try again. Leanne felt tears sting her eyes, but blinked them back. I stay because I want to. Because this is the first place I felt like I belong in longer than I can remember. They stood there in the dim barn, surrounded by broken things they were slowly making whole again, and something shifted between them. Not quite said, not quite acknowledged, but there nonetheless, a connection deeper than employer and worker, more complicated than friendship. Ethan reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face. His hand was rough, calloused, warm. You belong here, he said quietly. Don't ever think you don't. Leanne's breath caught. She covered his hand with hers, her bandaged palm against his scarred knuckles, and nodded because words felt insufficient. They finished the work in silence, but it was different now. Charged with possibility, weighted with hope neither of them had expected to feel again. The next few weeks were a blur of repair and survival, but the burden felt lighter somehow. They rebuilt the chicken coop together, this time with a stronger roof design that Ethan sketched out on a scrap of wood. They patched the barn wall and reinforced it with extra supports. They cleared the debris, reset the fence posts, worked until their bodies ached and their hands were raw. But every night, they sat together by the fire, sharing the day's small victories and defeats. And every morning, Leanne woke to find small gestures that spoke louder than words. The woodbox filled when she knew Ethan had worked late, coffee already hot on the stove, her boots cleaned of yesterday's mud and set by the door. She responded in kind, mending his shirts with careful stitches, making sure he ate before he went back outside, leaving water and food where he'd find them during his long days working the land. They were building something together, and both of them knew it. Not just a ranch, not just a partnership, something deeper, something that felt like the beginning of home. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a cold that bit through clothes and settled deep in bones. The first hard freeze arrived in early November, turning the ground to iron and the water in the buckets to ice overnight. Leanne woke one morning to find frost coating the inside of the cabin windows, delicate patterns like ferns drawn by invisible hands. Her breath misted in the air despite the fire she'd banked the night before. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and hurried to the stove, coaxing the embers back to life with kindling and patience. Outside, the world had transformed. Everything was covered in a thin layer of white. Not snow yet, but frost so thick it looked like snow in the early light. The cattle stood huddled together in their pen, their breath rising in clouds. The chickens refused to leave their coop, and Leanne couldn't blame them. Ethan was already up, already outside checking the animals, despite the brutal cold. She could see him through the window, his coat pulled tight, his hat dusted with frost. He moved among the cattle with practiced ease, checking their hooves, running his hands along their sides, looking for any signs of frostbite or illness. Leanne dressed quickly, pulling on every layer she owned, and went outside with a bucket of warm water she'd heated on the stove. The cold hit her like a wall, stealing her breath, making her eyes water. "You should stay inside," Ethan called out when he saw her. "So should you." She brought the warm water to the cattle, broke the ice on their trough, watched them drink gratefully. Ethan came to stand beside her, his face red from the cold, his eyes sharp and assessing as he studied the sky. "This is just the beginning," he said. "Real winter hasn't even started yet." "What do we need to do?" "Everything we can think of, and then some more." He turned to look at the barn, the cabin, the land stretching out around them. "We need more wood. A lot more. Need to make sure the barn doesn't have any leaks. Need to get more feed stored before the ground gets too hard to move anything. Then we better get started." They worked through that day and the next and the one after that, racing against the approaching winter. Ethan taught Leanne how to split wood properly, how to read the grain and find the sweet spot where the axe would bite deep and true. She learned quickly, her arms growing stronger with each swing, her aim becoming more accurate. They stacked wood until they had a pile taller than Ethan, then started another pile. They patched every crack in the barn they could find, stuffing gaps with old rags and mud that would freeze solid and keep out the worst of the wind. They brought in every scrap of feed they could gather or afford, storing it in the driest corner of the barn. One afternoon, as they worked side by side splitting logs, Ethan paused and leaned on his axe handle. "You know," he said, "most people would have left by now." Leanne set down her own axe and wiped sweat from her forehead despite the cold. "Most people aren't me. No, they're not." He studied her with that intense gaze that always made her feel seen in a way that was both uncomfortable and comforting. "Why do you stay? Really? It can't just be because you have nowhere else to go. You're smart enough, strong enough. You could find work in town if you wanted. Probably better work than this." Leanne considered the question, looking around at the ranch that had slowly become familiar over the months. The cabin she'd scrubbed clean, the garden she'd planted and tended, the fences she'd helped repair, the animals she fed every day. "Because this is the first place I felt like I was building something instead of just surviving," she said finally. "In town, I'd always be the foreign widow people whisper about. Here, I'm just Leanne, and that's enough." "It's more than enough," Ethan said quietly. They held each other's gaze for a long moment, the air between them charged with things neither was quite ready to name. Then Ethan cleared his throat and picked up his axe again. "Come on, we've got at least 2 more hours of good light." As the days grew shorter and colder, Leanne and Ethan fell into new rhythms shaped by winter's demands. They rose before dawn to break ice on water troughs and make sure the animals had survived the night. They worked through the brief daylight hours, doing whatever tasks the weather allowed. And when darkness came early, they retreated to the cabin in the warmth of the stove. Those long evenings became something Leanne looked forward to more than she wanted to admit. They would sit close to the fire, Ethan mending harnesses or sharpening tools while Leanne sewed or darned socks. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence. Either way, it felt like belonging. One night, as snow finally began to fall in fat, lazy flakes outside the window, Ethan said, "Tell me something I don't know about you." Leanne looked up from the shirt she was mending. "Like what?" "Anything. Something you've never told anyone else." She thought about it, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "When I was a girl in China, I wanted to be a teacher. I loved learning, loved books. My father taught me to read even though most girls weren't educated. He said knowledge was the one thing no one could take from you." "What happened?" "Life happened. My family needed me to marry to help support them, so I did." She shrugged, but the gesture didn't hide the old ache in her voice. "That's just how it was." "Do you regret it?" "No. Chen was a good man, and if I hadn't married him, I wouldn't have come to America, wouldn't have ended up here." She looked at Ethan. "So maybe everything that seemed like an ending was really just a path to something else." "That's a generous way to look at it." "It's the only way I can look at it and not go mad." Ethan was quiet for a moment, then set down the leather strap he'd been working on. "My turn? If you want." "I had a daughter," he said, the words coming slowly, carefully, like he was handling something fragile. "She was 4 when I left for the war. Blonde hair like her mother, laughed at everything. Used to follow me around the farm asking 1,000 questions." Leanne's heart clenched. She knew from his use of past tense what was coming, but she stayed quiet, letting him speak. "She got sick while I was gone. Scarlet fever. My wife wrote me, but the letter didn't reach me until after both of them were already dead and buried." His voice was rough, thick with old grief. "I wasn't there. I was off fighting in a war that didn't matter, and I wasn't there when they needed me." "That wasn't your fault, wasn't it?" He looked at her, his eyes shadowed. "I chose to go. Thought I was doing something noble, something important. Turns out the only important thing was the one I left behind." Leanne set down her sewing and moved to sit beside him. She didn't touch him, didn't offer empty platitudes, just sat close enough that he could feel her presence. "You can't carry that forever," she said quietly. "It'll break you." "Maybe I deserve to be broken." "No." Her voice was firm. "You deserve to heal. to build something new, to find a reason to keep going. Ethan looked at her, and something in his expression cracked open. What if I've already found it? The question hung between them, heavy with meaning. Leon's breath caught, her heart suddenly pounding. Before she could answer, a loud crack from outside made them both jump. They rushed to the window and saw that a heavy branch, weighted down with snow, had broken off one of the old trees near the barn and crashed through part of the fence. "Damn it," Ethan muttered, already reaching for his coat. "You can't fix it in the dark, in the snow. If the cattle get out, they won't. They're smarter than to wander in this weather. We'll fix it first thing in the morning." Ethan hesitated, clearly torn between practicality and the ingrained need to handle everything immediately. Finally, he nodded and set his coat back down. They returned to their spots by the fire, but the moment had passed, the vulnerability closed back up. Still, something had shifted. Something had been acknowledged, even if not fully spoken. The snow continued through the night, and by morning, the world was buried under 6 inches of white. Leon had never seen anything quite like it. The way it transformed the harsh, barren land into something almost beautiful, softening edges and covering flaws. She and Ethan spent the morning digging out, clearing paths to the barn and well, making sure the animals had access to water and food. The cold was brutal, numbing fingers and toes despite gloves and boots. But they worked steadily, methodically. 2 people who had learned to function as a team. By afternoon, they'd repaired the fence and cleared the broken branch. Leon was hauling the last of it to the woodpile when she heard hoofbeats. She straightened, her hand going to the small of her back where it ached, and saw 3 riders coming up the path. Even from a distance, she recognized one of them, Birch. Her stomach dropped. Ethan had told her about Calder's Foreman, about the offer to buy the land that Ethan had refused. She'd hoped that was the end of it, but apparently not. "Ethan!" she called. He emerged from the barn, saw the riders, and his whole body went tense. He walked to meet them, and Leon followed, staying close despite the sudden fear coiling in her gut. Birch dismounted when they got close, his face carefully neutral. The 2 men with him stayed on their horses, hands resting casually near their gun belts, in a way that was clearly meant to be noticed. "Hail," Birch said, his breath misting in the cold air. "Didn't expect to find you still here. Where else would I be? Thought maybe the winter would have driven you out by now, or the storms." His gaze flicked to the repaired barn, the patched cabin, the evidence of hard work and stubborn survival. "Place looks better than I expected. What do you want, Birch?" The foreman pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Mr. Calder asked me to deliver this. Official notice. You're 3 months behind on your territorial taxes." Ethan's jaw clenched. "I know what I owe." "Do you? Because according to this, if you don't pay by the end of the month, the territory has the right to seize the property and auction it off." Birch held out the paper. "And we both know who's going to be the highest bidder at that auction." Ethan took the notice but didn't look at it. His eyes stayed locked on Birch. "How much?" $40. It might as well have been 1,000. Leon could see it in Ethan's face. The knowledge that they didn't have $40, couldn't get $40, not in time. "Mr. Calder's still willing to make a deal," Birch continued, his tone almost sympathetic. "You sell to him now, he'll pay you enough to relocate, start over somewhere easier. Otherwise," he shrugged, "well, you lose it all anyway, and you get nothing. Tell Calder he can go to hell." One of the men behind Birch laughed, a sound without humor. "You're being stupid, Hale. This place is barely standing. You got no money, no prospects. You're one bad winter away from dying out here." Ethan took a step forward, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "And yet I'm still here, still standing. That must bother Calder something fierce." "It don't bother him at all," the man shot back. "He's just waiting for nature to do what you're too stubborn to do yourself." "Then he's got a long wait." Birch held up a hand, forestalling whatever his companion was about to say. "Look, Hale, I'm just delivering the message. You got until the end of the month. After that, the law's the law." He remounted his horse, and the 3 of them turned to leave. But before they did, one of the other men looked at Leon with a sneer. "That the Chinese woman Calder sent you? She worth dying over?" The words were barely out of his mouth before Ethan moved. He grabbed the man's saddle, nearly pulling him off his horse, his face twisted with fury. "You want to run your mouth? You do it about me," Ethan said, his voice low and deadly. "But you say one more word about her, and we're going to have a problem that won't end with talking." The man's hand dropped to his gun, but Birch's voice cut through the tension. "Stand down, both of you." He looked at Ethan. "Let him go." For a long moment, Ethan didn't move. Then he released the saddle and stepped back, his hands clenched into fists. The riders left, their horses kicking up snow, leaving deep tracks in their wake. Leon walked over to Ethan, saw him shaking, not from cold, but from rage barely contained. The paper crumpled in his fist. "What are we going to do?" she asked quietly. "I don't know." His voice was hollow, defeated in a way she'd never heard before. "I don't know." That night, Ethan barely spoke. He sat at the table, the tax notice spread in front of him, staring at it like he could make the numbers change through sheer force of will. Leon made dinner, thin soup from the last of their stored vegetables, and some salt pork she'd been saving. She set a bowl in front of him, but he didn't touch it. "You need to eat," she said. "I'm not hungry." "Ethan, $40. He laughed bitterly. "I've been breaking my back on this land for 3 years, and I can't even scrape together $40. We'll find a way." "How?" "We got nothing to sell. The cattle aren't worth enough. I can't sell the tools or we couldn't work. Can't sell the land because that's what they want." He pushed the bowl away. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I should just cut my losses and walk away." "You don't mean that." "Don't I?" He looked at her, and she saw real despair in his eyes. "What am I fighting for? A piece of land that's killing me inch by inch? A future that's never going to come?" Leon sat down across from him, reached across the table, and took his hands. They were rough, scarred, the hands of a man who'd worked himself to the bone trying to build something that kept threatening to fall apart. "You're fighting because this is yours," she said firmly. "Because you didn't let the war break you, didn't let losing your family destroy you, didn't let 3 years of hardship drive you away. You're fighting because that's who you are." "I'm tired, Leon. I'm so damn tired." "I know, so am I. But we've come this far. We can go a little further." "We?" "Yes, we." She squeezed his hands. "You think I'm going to let them take this place without a fight? You think I'm going to watch you give up now?" Something shifted in his expression. Not hope, exactly, but something closer to determination. "You really won't leave, will you?" "Not unless you throw me out." "Never." The word came out fierce, certain. "I'd burn this place down before I'd send you away." They sat there in the flickering firelight, hands clasped across the table, and Leon felt the weight of what they were facing, but also the strength of what they'd built together. "We'll figure it out," she said. "Somehow." Ethan nodded, and though the despair hadn't entirely left his eyes, it was joined now by something else. Trust. In her. In them. The next few days were tense, both of them acutely aware of the deadline approaching like a storm on the horizon. They worked even harder, as if sheer effort could somehow conjure the money they needed. But deep down, they both knew it wouldn't be enough. Leon lay awake at night, her mind racing, turning over possibilities. They could try to borrow the money, but who would lend to them? They could sell something, but what? Everything they had was essential to survival. On the third night after Birch's visit, as Ethan slept fitfully on his bedroll near the stove, Leon made a decision. She rose quietly, careful not to wake him, and dug through her small bundle of belongings in the dark. At the very bottom, wrapped in cloth and hidden away, was the jade bracelet her mother had given her before she left China. Leon unwrapped it slowly, feeling the cool smoothness of the stone against her palm. It was beautiful, deep green with veins of lighter color running through it like rivers. Her mother had worn it every day of her life until she'd pressed it into Leon's hands and told her to keep it safe, that it would protect her. But what good was protection if she lost everything that mattered? She rewrapped the bracelet and tucked it into her pocket, then lay back down, her decision made. In the morning, before Ethan woke, she told him she needed to go into town for supplies. He looked at her suspiciously. "What supplies?" "Thread, needles, a few other things." She kept her voice casual, hoping he wouldn't press. "I'll come with you." "No need. You've got work here. I'll be back before dark. Ethan studied her face, and she could see him trying to decide whether to argue. Finally, he nodded. Be careful. And if you see Calder or any of his men, I'll avoid them. She hitched up the wagon, a skill she'd learned over the months, and set out before Ethan could change his mind or ask more questions. The ride into town seemed longer than usual. Every mile weighted with what she was about to do. The bracelet sat heavy in her pocket, a physical reminder of everything she was about to give up. When she reached Bitterroot, the town was quiet, most people driven indoors by the cold. Leon went first to the jewelry shop, a small, dusty place she'd noticed before but never entered. The owner was an old man named Fletcher, with rheumy eyes and gnarled hands. He looked up when she entered, surprise flickering across his face at the sight of a Chinese woman in his shop. Help you? His voice was neutral, carefully polite. Leon pulled out the bracelet and set it on the counter. I need to sell this. Fletcher picked it up, and his demeanor changed immediately. His eyes sharpened, his hands suddenly gentle as he turned the bracelet over, examining it in the light. This is fine work, he said. Very fine. Old, too. Where'd you get it? It was my mother's. Now it's mine. She met his gaze steadily. How much will you give me for it? Fletcher pursed his lips, clearly calculating. I could give you $30. Leon's heart sank. So close, but not enough. I need 40. Can't do 40. 30's fair for something like this, considering I got to resell it. It's worth more than that, and you know it. Maybe. But jade's not in high demand around here. 30's my offer. Leon picked up the bracelet, her mind racing. She needed $10 more. $10 that might as well be $100 for how impossible they seemed to get. She left the jewelry shop and walked through town, her heart heavy, the bracelet burning in her pocket like a coal. She passed the general store, the saloon, the church. The church. Leon stopped, staring at the small white building with its simple cross. She'd never been inside, had never thought she'd be welcome. But desperation made strange allies. She pushed open the door. Inside it was quiet and dim, light filtering through simple windows, dust motes dancing in the beams. A woman knelt at the front, her head bowed, her hands clasped. Leon hesitated, then walked forward, her boots loud on the wooden floor. The woman looked up. She was older, maybe 60, with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She stood, brushing dust from her skirt. Can I help you, dear? I'm looking for the preacher. He's not here. Won't be back until next Sunday. The woman studied Leon with open curiosity. I'm Mrs. Carson. I tend to the church. What do you need? Leon pulled out the bracelet. I need to sell this. For $40. To pay my husband's taxes so they can't take our land. Mrs. Carson took the bracelet, examined it with the same careful attention Fletcher had shown. Then she looked at Leon with new interest. You're Ethan Hale's wife, the Chinese woman everyone's been talking about. Leon lifted her chin. Yes. Heard you've been working that land like your life depends on it. It does. Mrs. Carson smiled, and it transformed her whole face. Good. Calder's a bully who needs to learn he can't have everything he wants just because he's got money. She disappeared into a back room and returned a few minutes later with a small cloth bag. She pressed it into Leon's hands. $40. Leon stared at the bag, then at Mrs. Carson. Why are you doing this? Because I know what it's like to fight for something that matters. And because watching people like Calder lose is one of life's great pleasures. She patted Leon's hand. Use it well. Don't let that bastard win. Leon felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just keep fighting. Leon left the church with the money clutched in her hands and the bracelet gone, given to a stranger who understood better than most what it meant to hold on to something worth keeping. She went straight to the land office, paid the taxes in full, and got a receipt stamped and signed as proof. The clerk barely looked at her, just counted the money and pushed the paper across the counter. Leon folded it carefully and put it in her pocket, right where the bracelet had been. Then she drove home as fast as the horse could manage, her heart lighter despite what she'd given up. Ethan was in the yard when she arrived, pacing like a caged animal, his face tight with worry. When he saw her, relief flooded his features. Where have you been? It's nearly dark. Leon climbed down from the wagon and pulled out the receipt. She held it out to him without a word. Ethan stared at it, his eyes widening as he read. You paid the taxes. Yes. How? He looked up at her, confused, almost frightened. Lien, where did you get $40? I sold something that was mine. What? What could you possibly... Understanding dawned in his eyes. The bracelet. Your mother's bracelet. It was just a thing. It wasn't just a thing. It was all you had left of your family. His voice cracked. You shouldn't have done that. Yes, I should have. She stepped closer, taking his hands. That bracelet was supposed to protect me. And it did. It protected both of us. It saved this land, this life we're building. What better protection could there be? Ethan pulled her into his arms suddenly, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. She felt him shaking, felt the wet warmth of tears against her hair. I don't deserve you, he said, his voice muffled. Yes, you do, and I deserve you. We deserve this. She pulled back just enough to look at him. We fought for it, together. He cupped her face in his rough hands and kissed her, deep and fierce and full of everything he couldn't say. And Lien kissed him back, pouring into it all her own unspoken feelings. The fear, the hope, the love she'd been trying not to name. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. We'll show Birch this tomorrow, he said. Make sure he knows the land's not for sale. Not now. Not ever. Together, Lien said. Together. And standing there in the cold yard, holding each other as the sun set and stars began to appear, they both knew something had changed. They weren't just partners anymore. They weren't just two people surviving side by side. They were something more. Something worth every sacrifice, every hardship, every fight. They were home. They rode to town together the next morning, the tax receipt folded carefully in Ethan's coat pocket, both of them silent but united in purpose. The sky was clear and cold, the sun bright but offering little warmth, and the frozen ground rang hard beneath the wagon wheels. Lien sat close to Ethan on the narrow bench, their shoulders touching with each jostle of the wagon. She could feel the tension in him, coiled tight like a spring ready to release, and she understood it. This wasn't just about showing proof of payment. This was about standing up to Calder, about claiming their right to exist on land that wanted to swallow them whole. When they reached Bitterroot, the town was more active than it had been the day before. Men gathered outside the saloon, women moved between shops. Children played in the street despite the cold. Several heads turned as the wagon passed, eyes following them with open curiosity. Ethan pulled the wagon to a stop outside the land office, and they climbed down together. The clerk inside, the same bored man who'd taken Lien's money yesterday, looked up with barely concealed irritation at being disturbed again. Help you? Ethan placed the receipt on the counter. Need this recorded. Taxes paid in full on the Hale property, Section 12. The clerk picked it up, examined it with narrowed eyes like he was looking for fraud, then reluctantly pulled out a large ledger. He made a notation, his pen scratching across the page, then stamped the receipt with a heavy thunk. You're square with the territory, he said, pushing the paper back across the counter. For now. What's that supposed to mean? Ethan's voice was dangerously quiet. Means taxes come due again next year, and the year after that. The clerk shrugged. Way things work. We'll be here. We'll see. Ethan's hand clenched on the counter, but Lien touched his arm gently. We got what we came for. Let's go. They were halfway to the wagon when a voice called out behind them. Well, looks like you found some money after all. They turned. Ridge Calder stood on the boardwalk outside his office, thumbs hooked in his belt, that familiar smug expression on his face. Birch stood behind him, along with the two men who'd ridden out to the ranch. Ethan's whole body went rigid. Taxes are paid. Land stays ours. I can see that. Calder walked down the steps, his boots loud on the wooden planks. I'm curious, though. Where'd a man who couldn't scrape 2 nickels together suddenly find $40? That's none of your business. Oh, but it is my business. I make it my business to know everything that happens in this territory. His gaze slid to Lien, assessive and cold. Did your little Chinese woman steal it for you? I hear her people are good at that. The words were barely out of his mouth before Ethan moved. He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and grabbed Calder by his expensive coat, slamming him back against the wall of the building. "Say that again," Ethan said, his voice like gravel. "Say one more damn word about her and see what happens." Birch and the other men started forward, hands going to their guns, but Calder held up a hand to stop them. He looked at Ethan with something like amusement, completely unafraid despite being pinned against the wall. "Defending her honor?" Calder's smile was sharp. "That's touching, really, but it doesn't change the facts." "What facts?" "That you're barely holding on. That one bad season, one hard winter, one piece of bad luck, and you'll lose everything anyway." Calder's voice dropped lower, meant only for Ethan. "I can wait. I'm a patient man. And when you finally break, I'll be right there to pick up the pieces for pennies on the dollar." Ethan shoved him harder against the wall. "You're going to be waiting a long time. Am I?" Calder glanced at Leon again. "Or will she be the thing that breaks you? Because everyone knows what happens when you tie yourself to bad luck." Ethan's fist drew back, and Leon knew he was a heartbeat away from doing something that would land him in jail or worse. She stepped forward quickly, putting herself between them. "Ethan, he's not worth it." "Listen to her," Calder said smoothly. "She's smarter than you are." "We're leaving." Leon put her hand on Ethan's chest, felt his heart hammering beneath her palm. "Let him go." For a long moment, Ethan didn't move. The street had gone quiet, people stopping to watch the confrontation, waiting to see if it would turn violent. Then, slowly, Ethan released Calder and stepped back. "You stay away from my land," he said, "and you stay away from my wife." The word hung in the air, wife, and Leon felt her breath catch. They hadn't discussed it, hadn't made it official, but Ethan had claimed her publicly, had drawn a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Calder straightened his coat, his smile never wavering. "Your wife? That's interesting. Didn't realize you'd made it legal. Legal enough. Well then, congratulations. Though I have to wonder what kind of future you're offering her. A failing ranch, a life of poverty, some husband you are." Leon stepped forward before Ethan could respond. She looked Calder directly in the eyes, her voice calm and clear enough to carry to the watching crowd. "I chose this life. I chose him. And I'd rather have one day of honest work on our land than a lifetime of comfort bought with cruelty." She paused. "You can keep your money, Mr. Calder. We don't want it. We don't need it, and we're not leaving." Calder's smile finally faded. "You're making a mistake. That's for us to decide." Leon took Ethan's hand and walked toward the wagon, her spine straight, her head high. She could feel every eye on them, could hear the whispers starting, but she didn't look back. They climbed onto the wagon in silence. Ethan picked up the reins, but before he could snap them, he turned to look at her. "You meant that? What you said back there?" "Every word." "I called you my wife. I should have asked first." "Yes, you should have." Leon smiled despite everything. "But I'm not complaining." Something in Ethan's expression softened, warmed. "Good, because I meant it too." They drove out of town side by side, and though Leon knew they'd made an enemy more dangerous than the weather or the land, she also knew they'd made a choice that couldn't be unmade. They had chosen each other, and that was worth whatever came next. The ride home was quiet, both of them processing what had happened, what had been said. The sun was high and bright, but the wind carried a bite that promised more cold to come. When they finally reached the ranch, Ethan pulled the wagon to a stop, but didn't immediately get down. He sat there, hands still on the reins, staring at the cabin and barn and the land stretching out around them. "I should have handled that better," he said finally. "Should have kept my temper." "He was trying to provoke you. You showed restraint." "Barely." Ethan turned to look at her. "But when he talked about you like that, when he—" He stopped, his jaw working. "I couldn't let it stand." "I know." Leon covered his hand with hers. "And I'm grateful. But Ethan, we need to be smart about this. Calder's powerful. He's got money and influence, and he's not going to give up just because we paid the taxes. So what do? We make this place succeed. We make it so undeniably profitable that he can't claim we're failing. We prove to everyone that we belong here." Ethan looked at her with something like wonder. "How did I get so lucky?" "Lucky?" Leon laughed. You got saddled with a cursed widow that half the territory thinks will bring you ruin. Best thing that ever happened to me. The words were simple, honest, and they hit Leon with unexpected force. She felt tears prick her eyes, but blinked them back. Come on, she said, climbing down from the wagon. We've got work to do. They spent the rest of that day and the days that followed working with renewed purpose. If they were going to prove Calder wrong, they needed to do more than just survive. They needed to thrive. Ethan started planning for spring planting, sketching out ideas for expanding the garden, for bringing in crops they could sell in town. Leon mended every piece of equipment they owned, making sure nothing would break when they needed it most. They reinforced the barn further, built a better shelter for the cattle, improved the chicken coop until it was actually sturdy. The work was endless, exhausting, but there was a difference now. Before, they'd been working to survive. Now they were working toward something, a future they could both see, both want. One evening, as they sat by the fire after another long day, Ethan pulled something from his pocket. It was a simple silver band, old and worn, the metal dull from years of use. This was my mother's, he said quietly. Only thing I kept from before. I know it's not much, and I know we already said the words in town, but he took Leon's hand. Will you marry me, properly? Make it real. Leon looked at the ring, then at Ethan's face, and saw everything she needed to see. Not promises of wealth or ease, not guarantees of comfort, just honest devotion and the determination to build something worth having. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll marry you. Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger. It was too loose, sliding around, but Leon didn't care. She would wrap thread around it to make it fit, would wear it until the day she died. They kissed in the firelight, gentle and sweet, and when they pulled apart, Ethan said, We'll go to town next week. Find the circuit preacher. Do it right. I don't need right. I just need you. You'll have both. They made plans quietly over the next few days, between chores and meals and the ordinary rhythm of their lives. They would marry on a Sunday, keep it simple, invite Mrs. Carson since she'd been the one to help them when they needed it most. But 2 days before they were set to go to town, the weather turned vicious again. It started with wind, gusting so hard it rattled the cabin and tore at the barn. Then came sleet, sharp little pellets of ice that stung exposed skin and made everything slick and treacherous. By evening, it had turned to freezing rain, coating everything in a layer of ice that glittered in the fading light. This is bad, Ethan said, staring out the window at the devastation forming. Real bad. The cattle are as protected as we can make them. Going out there now would be suicide. But they both knew that if the ice got heavy enough, if branches started falling, the animals could be in real danger. They took turns through the night, one sleeping while the other kept watch, listening for sounds of trouble. Leon woke to her shift around midnight, the cabin dark except for the glow of the stove. Ethan was asleep on his bedroll, his face relaxed in a way it never was during the day. She sat by the window, watching ice form on the glass in delicate patterns, listening to the eerie silence that came with freezing rain. No wind now, just the steady tick-tick-tick of ice hitting wood and earth. Around 2 a.m, she heard it, a sharp crack that echoed across the frozen landscape, followed by a heavy crash. Leon was on her feet immediately, shaking Ethan awake. Something fell, near the barn. They dressed quickly, layering everything they had, and ventured outside into a world transformed into glass. Every surface was coated in ice, the ground, the buildings, the few remaining trees. It was beautiful and deadly. They made their way carefully to the barn, their boots slipping on the frozen ground, and found that one of the old cottonwoods near the creek had split under the weight of ice. Half of it had fallen toward the barn, missing the structure by mere feet. But the other half was still standing, listing dangerously, groaning with the weight of ice accumulating on its remaining branches. That's going to come down, Ethan said, and when it does, it'll hit the barn. They looked at each other in the darkness, both understanding what that meant. The barn held their feed, their tools, everything they needed to make it through the winter. If it was destroyed, they were finished. We have to cut it down, controlled, before it falls on its own. In this? Ethan, we can barely stand, let alone work an axe. We don't have a choice. They retrieved axes from the barn, the handles so cold they burned to touch even through gloves. The tree loomed above them, creaking ominously, ice-laden branches swaying with invisible weight. Ethan positioned himself on the side away from the barn and took the first swing. The blade bit into frozen wood with a dull thunk, sending up a spray of ice crystals. He swung again and again, each impact echoing across the silent landscape. Leanne worked beside him, her smaller axe taking smaller bites but contributing to the growing wedge. Her arms burned with effort, her hands ached despite the gloves, but she didn't stop. The tree groaned above them, shifting, and Ethan called out, "Move back!" And they scrambled away just as a massive branch broke free and crashed down where they'd been standing. "This is insane," Leanne gasped, her heart hammering. "You want to stop?" She looked at the barn, thought about everything they'd built, everything they stood to lose. "No, keep going." They worked for what felt like hours, but was probably less than one, cutting deeper into the trunk, creating the wedge that would direct the fall away from the barn. Ice coated their clothes, their faces, made every movement treacherous. Finally, Ethan stepped back, assessing their work. "Should be enough. When it goes, it'll fall toward the creek, away from everything." "Should be? Best I can do." He took one more massive swing, and the tree gave a long, tortured creak. Then it began to lean, slowly at first, then faster, crashing down in an explosion of ice and splintering wood that seemed to go on forever. When the noise finally stopped, the tree lay across the frozen creek bed, exactly where Ethan had intended, the barn untouched. They stood there in the darkness, both breathing hard, both shaking from exertion and cold, and the adrenaline of narrowly avoiding disaster. "We did it," Leanne said. "We did it." Ethan pulled her into his arms, holding her tight despite the ice and cold. "We actually did it." They made their way back to the cabin, stripped off their frozen outer layers, and huddled by the stove. Ethan built up the fire while Leanne made hot coffee with shaking hands. When they finally sat down, wrapped in blankets, their cold-numbed fingers wrapped around warm cups, Ethan said, "You know, most women would have run screaming by now. Most men wouldn't have chosen to live out here in the first place." "Fair point." He studied her over the rim of his cup. "You really want this life?" "The truth, Leanne. No pretending." She thought about it, about the endless work and constant danger, about the cold and the isolation, and the way every single day was a fight. Then she thought about the alternative, returning to town, to boarding houses, and closed doors in a life spent invisible and unwanted. "I want this," she said, "not because it's easy, because it's ours, because we built it together, because when I wake up in the morning, I know exactly who I am and where I belong." She met his eyes. "I've never had that before. It's worth every hardship." Ethan set down his cup and moved to sit beside her on the cot. He took her hand, his thumb brushing over the loose ring on her finger. "I love you," he said quietly. "I don't know if I'm supposed to say it like that, if there's a better way, but that's the truth of it. I love you, and I can't imagine doing any of this without you." Leanne felt tears slide down her cheeks, warm against her cold skin. "I love you too. I think I have for a while now. I was just afraid to name it." "Afraid of what?" "That it would make losing it hurt more." Ethan wiped her tears away with his rough thumb. "We're not going to lose this. Not to Calder, not to the weather, not to anything. I promise you that." "You can't promise that." "Watch me." He kissed her then, and Leanne kissed him back, tasting coffee and hope, and the future they were fighting so hard to claim. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "Let's not wait until Sunday," he said. "Let's get married tomorrow. Today, actually, since it's already past midnight. I don't want to spend another day without making this official. The preacher might not be. I don't care if we have to wake him up. I want you to be my wife, legally and properly, before anything else can go wrong." Leanne smiled through her tears. "All right. Today, then." They held each other by the fire as dawn slowly broke outside, painting the ice-covered world in shades of pink and gold, and made quiet plans for the future they were determined to have. When morning came properly, the sun rising over a landscape transformed into crystal, They hitched up the wagon and made the treacherous journey back to town. The roads were sheets of ice, the going slow and dangerous, but they persevered. They found the preacher at the church, helping Mrs. Carson clear ice from the steps. He was a thin man with kind eyes who listened to their request and smiled. "You want to get married right now?" "If you're willing," Ethan said. The preacher looked at them, both disheveled from the night's work, both exhausted but determined, and nodded. "Come inside, let's make it official." The ceremony was brief, conducted in the small church with only Mrs. Carson as witness. The preacher spoke the words, asked the questions, and when Ethan said, "I will," his voice was strong and certain. When it was Leanne's turn, she looked at Ethan, at the scar on his face, at the strength in his eyes, at the man who had defended her, fought beside her, loved her when the rest of the world saw her as cursed, and her voice didn't waver. "I will." The preacher pronounced them married, and Ethan kissed her there in the cold church, with sunlight streaming through the windows and ice melting slowly outside. Mrs. Carson hugged them both, tears in her eyes. "You're going to make it," she said. "I know you will." They thanked the preacher, declined his invitation to stay for breakfast, and headed home as husband and wife. The journey back was easier somehow, even though the roads were just as treacherous. They sat close together on the wagon bench, Lion's hand in Ethan's, both of them quietly amazed that they'd actually done it. When they reached the ranch, everything looked the same as when they'd left. The cabin, the barn, the fallen tree still lying across the frozen creek. But it felt different. It felt like home in a way it never quite had before. They spent the rest of that day together, working side by side to clear the smaller branches from the fallen tree, checking on the animals, making sure everything had survived the storm. And when night fell and they returned to the cabin, there was a new ease between them, a sense of rightness that came from having made their choice official and binding. That night, they shared the narrow cot for the first time as husband and wife, holding each other close in the darkness, and Leanne felt a peace she'd never known before. She had fought for this, sacrificed for it, bled for it, and it was worth every moment. The winter that followed their wedding was the hardest either of them had ever known. But it was also the first time hardship felt bearable because it was shared. The cold settled in deep and relentless, temperatures dropping so low that water froze solid in minutes, and stepping outside felt like walking into a wall of knives. Snow fell in heavy waves, piling up against the cabin walls, burying fences, turning the world into an endless expanse of white that was beautiful and merciless in equal measure. But Leanne and Ethan faced it together, and that made all the difference. They developed routines shaped by necessity and survival. Every morning before dawn, Ethan would break the ice on the water troughs while Leanne fed the stove and made coffee strong enough to strip paint. They'd eat whatever they had, usually cornmeal mush or the last of the preserved vegetables, and then venture out into the cold to check the animals, clear paths through the snow, chop wood, haul water, do all the thousand small tasks that kept them alive. The cattle huddled together for warmth, their breath rising in clouds, ice forming on their eyelashes and muzzles. Leanne learned to check them daily for signs of frostbite, learned which ones were stronger and which needed extra attention. The chickens barely laid anymore, conserving their energy just to survive, but Leanne kept them fed and protected, knowing they'd be crucial come spring. The work was brutal, but every evening they'd return to the cabin together, strip off their frozen outer layers, and sit close to the fire. Sometimes they talked about their plans for spring, what crops to plant, which fences to repair first, how to expand the herd if they could afford it. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, Leanne mending by firelight while Ethan worked on tools or harnesses. And sometimes, when the wind howled particularly fierce outside and the cabin walls creaked under the assault, Ethan would pull Leanne close and they'd simply hold each other, drawing strength from the warmth and solidity of another human being who chose to stay. One particularly vicious night in late January, when the temperature had dropped so low that frost formed on the inside walls despite the roaring fire, Leanne woke to find Ethan already up, adding wood to the stove with urgent movements. "What's wrong?" she asked, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Fire was nearly out. Another hour and we'd have frozen." The words sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with temperature. They both knew that freezing to death was a real possibility out here. that people died every winter because fires went out, or cabins collapsed under snow, or 100 other small failures that added up to catastrophe. "I'll stay up the rest of the night," Leon said, starting to rise. "Make sure it doesn't happen again." "No." Ethan's voice was firm. "We'll both stay up. Take shifts. One watches the fire, the other sleeps. We can't afford to both be exhausted." So they did, trading off through the long hours of darkness, one tending the stove while the other rested fitfully. It became their routine on the coldest nights, a silent acknowledgement that survival required constant vigilance. But winter, for all its cruelty, couldn't last forever. The first signs of spring came in late March, tentative and uncertain. The days grew incrementally longer, the sun climbing higher in the sky and actually offering warmth instead of just light. The snow began to melt, slowly at first, then in rushing torrents as the temperatures rose above freezing during the day. The land transformed from white to brown, revealing all the winter damage that had been hidden: broken fences, damaged structures, debris scattered everywhere. But it also revealed something else: survival. They had made it through. Leon stood in the yard one morning, feeling genuine warmth on her face for the first time in months, and allowed herself a moment of pure relief. They'd done it. Against all odds, against Calder's predictions, against the brutal reality of the land itself, they'd survived. "Ready to get started?" Ethan's voice came from behind her. She turned to find him carrying tools, his face already set with determination. There was so much to do: repairs, planting, rebuilding everything that winter had broken. "More than ready," Leon said. They threw themselves into the work of spring with an energy born of relief and purpose. The garden was expanded, double the size of the year before, with careful rows marked out for vegetables they could eat and crops they could sell: potatoes, onions, carrots, beans, squash. Lion planted with meticulous care, her hands remembering the work even as her back protested the constant bending. Ethan repaired fences and structures, his movements efficient and practiced. He built a better shelter for the cattle, one that would withstand next winter's storms. He reinforced the barn, replaced boards that had rotted, made everything stronger than it had been before. They worked from sunup to sundown, their bodies aching, their hands permanently stained with dirt and work. But there was satisfaction in it. Every seed planted was a promise. Every fence repaired was a declaration that they weren't giving up. One afternoon in early April, as Lion was weeding the garden and Ethan was working on the barn, she heard hoofbeats and looked up to see a rider approaching. Her stomach clenched with instinctive wariness, but as the rider got closer, she realized it wasn't Birch or any of Calder's men. It was a woman, middle-aged, riding a sturdy mare and leading a pack horse loaded with supplies. Ethan emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his pants, and his face registered the same surprise Leon felt. The woman dismounted with easy grace and walked toward them, her weathered face breaking into a smile. "You must be the Hales," she said. "I'm Sarah Brennan. Got a ranch about 10 miles east of here." Ethan shook her hand cautiously. "What can we do for you, Mrs. Brennan?" "It's what I can do for you, actually." She gestured to the pack horse. "Heard you made it through the winter. Heard you stood up to Ridge Calder and his bullying. Figured you might need some help getting started with spring planting." Leon and Ethan exchanged glances, both uncertain whether to trust this unexpected generosity. Sarah seemed to read their hesitation and laughed. "I know how it sounds. Stranger showing up with gifts. But the truth is, Calder's been buying up land around here for years, squeezing out the small ranchers. Most folks are too scared to stand up to him. When I heard what you did, paying those taxes, telling him where to stick his offer, well, I figured it was time somebody helped the people fighting back." She unloaded the pack horse, revealing seeds, tools, some salted meat, and a bag of flour. "This isn't charity. Think of it as an investment. You succeed out here. It shows others they can too. That's worth more than money to me." Leon felt tears prick her eyes at the kindness, the solidarity. "Thank you. We'll pay you back." "You'll pay it forward," Sarah interrupted. "When you're on your feet proper, you help the next person trying to make it. That's how we survive out here, by looking out for each other instead of just ourselves." She stayed for coffee, sharing news about other ranchers in the area, offering advice about crops that grew well in their soil and which markets in town paid the best prices. By the time she left, Leon felt something she hadn't expected to feel, connected to a community she'd thought would never accept her. Over the following weeks, other neighbors stopped by. Not many, and not all friendly, but enough to matter. A rancher named Tom Wheeler brought over a breeding cow, saying his herd was getting too large anyway. Mrs. Carson from the church visited with preserves and gossip, her sharp eyes taking in all the improvements they'd made. "You're doing good work here," she said, sipping the tea Leon had made. "Better than Calder thought possible, I'd wager." "We're trying," Leon said. "You're succeeding. That's different." Mrs. Carson set down her cup. "I'll be honest with you, half the town thought you'd be gone by spring. The other half thought you'd be dead. But here you are, building something real. That means something." Word of their survival spread, and with it, slowly, attitudes began to shift. Not everywhere, not with everyone, but enough. The general store owner, Porter, extended them credit without prompting. A few other small ranchers began nodding to them in town instead of looking away. They were still outsiders. A scarred war veteran and a Chinese widow would never be fully accepted in a place like Bitterroot. But they were becoming familiar outsiders, known quantities, people who'd earned a grudging respect through sheer stubbornness and hard work. But not everyone was pleased with their success. It was late May when Bert showed up again, this time alone, his expression less smug than it had been before. "Hail," he said, dismounting. "Got a message from Mr. Calder." Ethan set down the post he'd been setting and walked over, his body language wary. "What does he want now?" "He wants to buy your spring crop. Whatever you're growing, he'll pay market rate. Maybe a bit above." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Why?" "Does it matter? It's a good offer." "It matters when it comes from a man who's been trying to run us off our land for a year." Birch sighed, and for the first time he looked less like Calder's enforcer and more like a tired man doing a job he was increasingly uncomfortable with. "Look, between you and me, Mr. Calder respects what you've done here. You proved him wrong. This offer, it's his way of saying maybe there's room for both of you in this territory. Or it's a trap. Or it's just business." Birch mounted his horse. "Think about it. You got a week to decide." He rode off, leaving Ethan and Leon standing in the yard, both trying to figure out what game Calder was playing now. That night, they debated long into the evening. "It could be legitimate," Leon said, playing devil's advocate. "We need the money. If he's offering above market rate, then he wants something," Ethan finished. "Calder doesn't do anything out of generosity. There's an angle we're not seeing." "So we refuse?" "I don't know." Ethan ran his hands through his hair in frustration. "If we refuse, and it was a genuine offer, we're cutting off a source of income we desperately need. If we accept and it's a trap, we could lose everything." They sat in silence for a long moment, both wrestling with the decision. "What does your gut tell you?" Leon asked finally. Ethan looked at her, his expression troubled. "My gut says Calder is a snake who's never done an honest thing in his life. But my head says we can't afford to turn down money based on suspicion alone." "Then we accept, but carefully. We get everything in writing. We deliver the crops ourselves. We don't give him any opportunity to cheat us." Ethan nodded slowly. "And if it goes wrong, we handle it together, like we handle everything else." When Birch returns a week later, Ethan gave him their answer. They'd sell to Calder, but only with a written contract specifying quantities, prices, and delivery dates. To their surprise, Birch agreed without argument and produced a contract that seemed straightforward and fair. They signed it, both still uneasy, but committed to the path they'd chosen. The spring crop came in better than they'd dared hope. The expanded garden flourished under Leon's care, rows of vegetables growing strong and healthy in the rich soil. The potatoes were particularly good, and they had surplus beans and onions beyond what they needed for themselves. In late June, they loaded up the wagon with their harvest and made the trip into town to deliver it to Calder's warehouse as agreed. The warehouse was a large building on the edge of town, and Calder himself was there when they arrived, supervising the unloading of goods from several other ranchers. He walked over as they pulled up, his expression neutral. "Hale, Mrs. Hale." "Calder," Ethan replied, his voice equally flat. "Let's see what you brought." They unloaded the wagon under Calder's watchful eye. He examined the vegetables, checked the quality, and to Leon's surprise, he nodded approvingly. "This is good produce, better than I expected." "We don't do anything halfway," Ethan said. "I'm beginning to see that." Calder pulled out a leather pouch and counted out payment, the full amount agreed upon, plus a bit extra. "For quality, and for proving me wrong." Ethan took the money, counted it himself, and pocketed it. "So, what's the catch?" "No catch." Calder's expression was unreadable. "I'm a businessman, Hale. I don't like losing, but I know when to recognize a situation for what it is. You're not going to fail. You're not going to give up. You're going to keep working this land and probably make something of it." "So you're giving up on getting our property?" "I didn't say that." Calder smiled slightly. "But I'm adjusting my timeline. Maybe decades instead of months. And in the meantime, if you're going to grow good crops, I might as well profit from buying them." It wasn't friendship. It wasn't even respect exactly. But it was acknowledgement, a recognition that they had earned their place, however grudgingly given. "We'll have more to sell come fall," Ethan said carefully. "If you're still buying, I'll be buying. Bring me quality like this and we can do business." They left the warehouse with more money than they'd had in months, both still wary but also relieved. They'd faced down Calder in the marketplace and come out ahead. That was worth something. With the money from their first sale, they bought more seeds, more tools, better feed for the animals. They invested every penny back into the ranch, making it stronger, more productive, more secure. Summer brought its own challenges: scorching heat, water shortages, constant vigilance against drought and pests. But Leon and Ethan faced each one with the confidence born of having survived so much already. The garden thrived. The cattle fattened on summer grass, the chickens laid consistently, and Leon traded eggs in town for other necessities. Slowly, incrementally, the ranch stopped being a place of bare survival and became something more, a working operation that might actually support them. One evening in late July, as they sat outside watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Ethan said, "You know what I was thinking?" "What?" "We should plant an orchard. Apples, maybe, or plums. Something that'll take a few years to produce but will be worth it long term." Leon looked at him, surprised. "That's planning pretty far ahead." "I know," Ethan took her hand. "But I'm starting to believe we'll be here to see it, that we're building something that'll last." "You didn't believe that before?" "Before, I was just trying to survive each day. Now," he squeezed her hand, "now I'm thinking about years from now. About what we'll leave behind, about maybe, someday, having children to pass this land to." Leon felt her breath catch. They'd never talked about children, had both been too focused on survival to think that far ahead. "You want children?" "I want a future. And you're part of that future. Children, orchards, a real house instead of this cabin, all of it." "The cabin's not so bad." "Leon, we can see daylight through the walls." She laughed despite herself. "Fair point." "So what do you think? Are we building something worth passing on?" Leon looked around at the land they'd fought so hard for, the garden she'd planted, the fences they'd repaired, the barn that stood straight and strong because they'd refused to let it fall. She thought about the neighbors who'd started helping them, the community slowly forming, the life they were creating day by day. "Yes," she said, "we are." They planted the orchard in early fall, 10 young apple trees that wouldn't bear fruit for years, but represented hope in its purest form. Each sapling was a declaration that they would be here to see it grow, that they were planting roots as deep as the trees themselves. When they returned to town to sell their fall harvest, which was even better than the spring crop, the reception was noticeably different. People nodded to them on the street. A few even stopped to talk, asking about their methods, their success. Porter at the general store greeted them with actual warmth. "Heard you brought in a hell of a potato crop this year." "We did all right," Ethan said modestly. "Better than all right from what I hear. You two are showing folks what's possible out here with hard work and determination." It was strange being seen as successful after so many months of being viewed as doomed, but Leon found she didn't mind it. They'd earned this recognition through blood and sweat, and refusing to quit when everything said they should. They were loading their wagon with supplies when Ridge Calder approached them in the street. The The crowd around them went quiet, people stopping to watch the interaction. "Hale! Mrs. Hale!" Calder's tone was formal, almost respectful. "I wanted to speak with you about something." Ethan's body tensed, but his voice stayed level. "I'm listening." "I'm hosting a gathering next month. All the successful ranchers in the territory discussing water rights, grazing rotation, things that affect all of us." He paused. "I'd like you to attend." The request hung in the air, shocking in its implications. This wasn't just business anymore. This was inclusion in the community's inner circle, recognition as equals rather than obstacles to be removed. "Why?" Ethan asked bluntly. "Because you've proven you belong here, and because the decisions we make affect your land as much as mine. Seems fair you should have a voice." It wasn't an apology for everything that had happened before. It wasn't friendship, but it was acceptance, and that mattered. "We'll be there," Ethan said. Calder nodded and walked away, leaving Leon and Ethan standing in the street with half the town watching. "Did that really just happen?" Leon asked quietly. "I think it did." They drove home in stunned silence, both processing what it meant. They'd won. Not just survived, not just endured, but actually won. They'd taken the worst Calder could throw at them and come out stronger. That night, lying in each other's arms in their narrow cot, Leon said, "Do you ever think about that first day? When Calder sent me to you like I was garbage he was discarding?" "All the time." "What do you think about it?" Ethan pulled her closer. "I think it was the best thing that ever happened to me. He thought he was punishing me. Turns out he gave me everything I ever needed." Leon smiled in the darkness. "We should thank him." "Don't push it." She laughed, and Ethan kissed her, and outside the wind blew gentle across land they'd claimed as their own through nothing more than determination and love. The gathering Calder hosted was held in late October, in the large barn on his main property. Leon and Ethan arrived together, both nervous despite their newfound confidence, both aware they were entering territory that had been closed to them before. But when they walked in, Sarah Brennan waved them over immediately, introducing them to other small ranchers who'd been impressed by their success. Tom Wheeler clapped Ethan on the back and asked about his fencing techniques. Even some of Calder's own men nodded respectfully. The meeting itself was productive. Discussions about shared resources, cooperative marketing, mutual aid during hard times. For the first time, Leanne and Ethan were part of these conversations, their opinions sought and valued. When Calder stood to speak, laying out plans for the coming year, he made a point of acknowledging the newer ranchers who'd established themselves despite difficult odds. "Success in this territory isn't about who was here first or who has the most land," he said, his eyes finding Leanne and Ethan in the crowd. "It's about who's willing to work hard enough to earn it, and I think we all know who's proven themselves this year." It wasn't an apology, but it was close enough. As fall deepened into winter, Leon and Ethan prepared once more for the cold months ahead, but this time they were ready. They had money saved from their crop sales, they had surplus feed stored, they had allies who would help if trouble came, and they had each other. On the first truly cold night of the season, as snow began to fall in soft flakes outside the window, Leon stood in the doorway of their cabin and looked out at the land they'd fought so hard for. The barn stood strong and straight, the fences were solid, the orchard saplings waited patiently for spring, the cattle were healthy and protected. Everything they'd built together was still standing, still thriving, still theirs. Ethan came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how far we've come. About that day in the hiring line when Calder tried to humiliate me and ended up giving me the greatest gift of my life." "You really see it that way?" "I do." She turned in his arms to face him. "Because if he hadn't sent me to you, I never would have found home. I never would have found you." "I love you," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll love you until the day I die and probably beyond that. I love you too, and I'm grateful for every hard day, every challenge, every moment that brought us here." They stood together in the doorway, watching snow fall on land that had tested them and found them worthy, and both felt the profound satisfaction of having fought for something worth keeping. The next spring, they would plant more crops. The spring after that, the orchard would start to bear fruit. Year by year, season by season, they would build on what they'd started, creating something that would outlast them both. But that was the future, and it could wait. For now, there was just this moment, a quiet evening, falling snow, and two people who'd found each other in the hardest place imaginable and decided that was exactly where they belonged. Ethan closed the door against the cold, and they moved to the warmth of the fire. Outside, the world was harsh and unforgiving, but inside there was love and partnership and the certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. They had started as two broken people discarded by a cruel man who thought he was throwing away garbage. Instead, he'd brought together exactly the partners each needed to transform barren ground into fertile earth, loneliness into belonging, survival into a life worth living. And that was worth more than all the land in the territory.